Before the myths, before the monarchs, there was a land shaped by silence, stone, and memory, from forgotten tribes to rising kingdoms, from whispered prayers in Iona to the roar of freedom at Bannockburn, from warrior queens and legendary rebels to centuries of bloodshed and rebirth. This is the untold story of Scotland, a nation that would not stop fighting to be heard. If you love powerful history told like never before, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel for more epic journeys, and drop a comment below. What part of Scotland's history inspires you the most? Now, let's begin. Before kings, before castles, before Scotland had a name, there were people here. They didn't write books, they didn't build empires, but they carved their story into the land. In stone, in fire, in silence. More than 5,000 years ago, long before the pyramids rose in Egypt, families lived on these northern isles, on Orkney, in the highlands, along the coasts. They built their homes from stone, set deep into the earth, thick-walled, round-roofed, protected from wind and sea. They lived in Skara Brae, a village older than Stonehenge. Inside you can still see the beds, the hearths, even the stone shelves where they kept their precious few belongings. Tools carved from bone and antler, jewelry made from shell and slate, not relics, reminders. These early Scots fished the cold northern waters. They hunted red deer and gathered berries from the moor. They followed the rhythm of the earth, sunrise, tide, season, and they watched the sky. They knew the stars by heart. And when the solstice came, they gathered at the great stone circles, Callanish, Stennis, Brodgar, giant sentinels aligned to the heavens, placed with purpose and with reverence. Why did they build them? We still don't know. Were they temples, calendars, maps of the spirit world, or were they doorways to something beyond? These stones weren't thrown together. They were carried across miles, shaped by hand, and raised with shared strength. To do that, you need more than tools. You need vision. You need belief. They didn't have a name for their land, but they had a story, passed from grandmother to child around firelight. A story where everything was alive. The rivers, the mountains, the wind. They buried their dead with care, laid in chambered cairns, wrapped in furs, surrounded by tools and offerings. They believed death was not an ending, but a journey. Later came the Bronze Age. New tools, new weapons, new ideas. Hill forts rose on the ridges. Trade routes stretched across sea and forest. But even then, the stone circles remained. Even then, the memory of the first people endured. We may never know their names, but we know they were here, that they shaped the land we walk on, and that in some way they still walk with us. This is where the story of Scotland truly begins, not with battles, not with crowns, but with fire, stone, and the stars. By the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire ruled most of the known world. Its armies marched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania, from the temples of Greece to the white cliffs of Britain. But here, at the northern edge of their empire, they met something different, a land of shadow and stone, of cold winds and thicker silence. They called it Caledonia. What they saw wasn't civilization. It was resistance. To the Romans, Scotland was a wild place. The terrain was harsh, forests, bogs, mountains. The people were harder. They met the Picts, fierce warriors who painted their bodies with blue dye, who moved like ghosts in the mist, and who vanished into the hills as quickly as they struck. The Romans tried to push forward. They built roads, outposts, fortresses, but Caledonia refused to be tamed. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian made a decision. Enough. He ordered the construction of a wall, Hadrian's Wall, stretching coast to coast across northern Britain. Not just a defense, but a line between the Roman world and the world they couldn't control. But Rome wasn't done yet. A few decades later, they tried again. Emperor Antoninus Pius built another wall further north, hoping to finally bring Caledonia to heel. The Antonine Wall was shorter but symbolic. A second attempt to dominate the land beyond. It failed, just like the first. The Roman soldiers were well trained, well armed, and well fed, but the land fought back. So did the people. The tribes of Caledonia raided outposts, burned settlements, and disappeared like smoke. They had no cities to conquer, no throne to seize, only pride and freedom. Over time, Rome pulled back, first to Hadrian's Wall, then further south. By the late 4th century, the empire was stretched thin. Civil wars, Germanic invasions, collapse. The legions were recalled, and Rome left Britain behind. They left behind ruins, roads, coins. But what they didn't leave was victory, because while Rome could conquer the world, it could not conquer Scotland. At the empire's peak, a whisper came from the north, a whisper of a people who would not kneel. That whisper would one day become a roar. As the Roman legions withdrew, the land they left behind fell into shadow. Tribes fought for dominance. Old powers collapsed. New names began to rise. And from across the sea came the Scoti, a Gaelic-speaking people from the island of Hibernia, known today as Ireland. They crossed the narrow waters and landed on the western shores of what we now call Argyll. These settlers brought more than weapons. They brought a culture, poetry, kinship, oral tradition, and fierce loyalty. They built a kingdom called Dalriata, nestled among the rugged coasts and island chains. But they were not alone. To the north and east lived the Picts, a proud and mysterious people. They carved their symbols into standing stones. They painted their bodies with swirling blue patterns. They worshipped the old gods and honored the dead with ancient rites. The Picts and the Scots were rivals. They raided each other's lands. Sometimes they allied. More often they fought. And yet, amid the chaos of tribes and feuds, something unexpected arrived. Not a warrior, not a king, but a monk. His name was Columba. In 563 AD, Columba left Ireland, driven by faith, exile, and vision. He sailed to a small windswept island just off the coast of Dalriata, a lonely rocky shore where the land meets the sea. There, he founded a monastery. The island was called Iona. It would become a spiritual lighthouse. Columba and his monks brought Christianity, not by force, but by example. They prayed, they farmed, they wrote, and they copied holy texts by hand, turning skin and ink into sacred scripture. From Iona, the faith spread, to Dalriata, to the Picts, even to the fierce northern kings. In time, the Scots and Picts, once enemies, would merge, not just through battle, but through belief. Because Christianity brought more than religion. It brought unity, shared festivals, shared laws, shared purpose. A warrior could still hold a sword. But now, he might also carry a cross. For a brief moment, the flame of faith illuminated the darkness. Not all converted, not all agreed, but the direction was set. Scotland would not rise by conquest alone. It would rise through spirit. And as churches replaced stone circles and gospel replaced legend, a new Scotland began to take shape. A Scotland with roots in two worlds, the sword and the scripture, the tribe and the cross. By the 11th century, the tribes of Scotland had forged something new. Kingdoms, lines had been drawn, crowns had been claimed, but power was still won the old way, with blood. In the year 1034, the throne passed to King Duncan I, a man of noble lineage descended from kings and saints. But 6 years later, Duncan was dead, killed not in cold blood, but in battle. The man who killed him was his cousin, a warlord, a noble, a king. His name was Macbeth. Forget the Shakespearean villain, the mad tyrant haunted by ghosts. The real Macbeth was something different. He ruled for 17 years, a long reign by medieval standards. And unlike many of his predecessors, he brought order. He rewarded the church. He went on pilgrimage to Rome, a sign of peace and prestige. He governed a court filled with warriors and monks, lords and judges. He may have spilled blood to take the throne, but he wore the crown well. Yet peace in medieval Scotland was always temporary. Far to the south, the tides of England were changing. Edward the Confessor ruled England, and many Scottish nobles had Anglo-Saxon ties through marriage, culture, or ambition. One such noble was Malcolm Canmore, the son of Duncan, exiled after his father's death. He fled to England and he waited for a chance, for an army. That chance came in 1054, when the English king backed Malcolm's return. And so, with English gold and Saxon swords, Malcolm marched north. In 1057, Macbeth was killed in battle. His stepson Lulac briefly took the throne, but he too was cut down. Malcolm Canmore became King Malcolm III. But Malcolm's reign was not just a restoration, it was a transformation. He married an English princess, Margaret of Wessex, a devout Christian, educated, fierce in faith. Together, they reshaped the soul of Scotland. Margaret built churches, introduced new religious customs, and pushed for reforms that aligned more with the English church than the Celtic. Under her influence, Gaelic culture began to fade at court. The Anglo-Norman world crept in. A new Scotland was being born, one that looked more like England. For some, it was progress. For others, a betrayal. The Highlands and Islands, the old world, resisted. The lowlands moved on. The kingdom was now caught between two worlds, one tribal, traditional, and wild, the other feudal, foreign, and structured. And as Scotland turned its gaze southward, toward the power and prestige of its wealthy neighbour, it also found itself caught in the growing shadow of England's ambition. The next century would not be one of peace, but of pressure. The crown had passed, the kings had changed, but the storm was just beginning. The descendants of King Malcolm III would rule for generations, blending Gaelic heritage with Anglo-Norman influence. By the 13th century, Scotland had become more centralized, more organized, and more prosperous than ever before. And then came Alexander III, a descendant of Malcolm III. He became king in 1249, crowned at just 8 years old. But despite his youth, Alexander's reign would be remembered as a golden age of peace and independence. He stood firm against English interference, especially from King Henry III of England. And under his rule, Scotland thrived. He secured Scotland's borders, most notably reclaiming the Western Isles from Norwegian control after the Battle of Largs in 1263. The Treaty of Perth soon followed, affirming Scottish sovereignty over the Hebrides. Trade flourished. The kingdom was stable, and for the first time in a long time, Scotland was at peace. But fate can turn swiftly. In 1286, disaster struck. On a stormy March night, while riding from Edinburgh to Kinghorn to reunite with his queen, King Alexander III's horse lost its footing on a cliffside path. He fell, and by morning, the king was dead. He left behind no surviving sons. Only a granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, just 3 years old, living across the sea. In 1290, while sailing to Scotland to be crowned, Margaret fell seriously ill during the sea voyage, most likely from a combination of seasickness and possibly dysentery or food poisoning. She died in the Orkney Islands, still far from the Scottish mainland. Scotland was suddenly leaderless. A strong, united kingdom had been built over decades, and with one fall, it was on the brink of collapse, a kingdom without a king, and England saw its chance. Edward I, King of England, called by some the Hammer of the Scots, offered to help. He summoned the nobles, he promised protection, and then he seized control. Edward forced Scottish lords to swear loyalty. He placed his garrisons in their castles. He stole the Stone of Destiny, Scotland's symbol of sovereignty, and carried it to Westminster. But not all Scots bowed. From the shadows, one man would rise. Not a king, not a noble, but a legend. William Wallace, born to minor nobility, or perhaps a farmer. His origins are shrouded in myth, but his rage was very real. After the English killed his father, and later his wife, Wallace raised a rebellion. He gathered blacksmiths, farmers, outlaws, ordinary men who refused to kneel. In 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's army crushed the English. It was one of history's great underdog victories. For a moment, Scotland was free. Wallace was named guardian of the realm. But his success brought enemies, from within and without. In 1305, he was betrayed, captured, dragged in chains to London, and executed in the most brutal way imaginable. He was hanged, drawn, quartered, but he never bowed, not once. His body was torn apart. His memory was not, because from Wallace's sacrifice, another would rise, Robert the Bruce. At first, Bruce was a politician, playing both sides, but in 1306, in a chapel, he murdered his rival and claimed the crown. It was a dark beginning. He was excommunicated, hunted, defeated. They say he hid in a cave. There, he watched a spider try, again and again, to spin its web, and succeed. Bruce returned. He fought. He rallied the clans, and in 1314 he faced the English at Bannockburn, outnumbered, outarmed, but not outwilled. Bruce's army smashed the English. Scotland was free. 6 years later, Scottish nobles sent a letter to the Pope, the Declaration of Arbroath. As long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never submit to English rule. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honor that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man surrenders but with his life. This wasn't just a war. It was a rebirth of land, of voice, of nation. Scotland had won her freedom. The English had been pushed back. A nation had risen from rebellion. But peace does not last forever. And in the quiet that followed Bannockburn, a different kind of storm began. It wasn't fought with swords, but with bloodlines. After the death of Robert the Bruce's son, David II, the crown passed to his nephew, Robert II, who founded the House of Stewart. This marked a new royal dynasty. Originally spelled Stuart, the name was later changed to Stuart when Mary, Queen of Scots, was raised in the French court, where the letter W was rarely used. In 1371, Robert II ascended the throne as the first king of the House of Stewart, and with him began a dynasty that would rule Scotland for more than 3 centuries. The Stuarts would bring unity, ambition, and chaos. Their reign was marked by brilliance and bloodshed, by poetry, and by prison. No Stuart would shine brighter or fall harder than a girl born into a kingdom she barely understood. Mary, Queen of Scots. She was crowned at just 9 months old, sent to France as a child, married a French prince, widowed at 18, and then returned home to rule a Scotland boiling with unrest. She was elegant, Catholic, and to many, too French. Her reign was marked by scandal. Her cousin Elizabeth ruled in England, Protestant, powerful, and paranoid. Mary married badly, first to Lord Darnley, a charming drunk with noble blood and dangerous ambition. He turned violent, jealous. He suspected Mary of infidelity. Then came an explosion. Darnley's house was blown apart. He was found strangled in the garden. The man accused of the murder, James Bothwell, and weeks later, Mary married him. To her enemies it was proof. To the people it was madness. The lords of Scotland rose. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate the throne. Her baby son, James VI, was crowned in her place. Mary fled to England, hoping for sanctuary. Elizabeth gave her a prison. For 19 years, Mary waited behind stone walls. Then, in 1587, her fate was sealed. Charged with plotting against Elizabeth, she was executed. A queen by birth, a prisoner by politics, a martyr by memory. But the story didn't end there, because her son, James VI of Scotland, would become James I of England. In 1603, the crowns were united. One man ruled both nations, not by conquest, but by inheritance. It was called the Union of the Crowns. Scotland and England remained separate kingdoms with one king, but unity didn't bring peace. James's son, Charles I, would wage war on his own people, religious division, civil war, regicide. The Stuarts would be exiled, restored, and exiled again. Their story was never simple, never still, and though their crown was shared between two nations, the tensions between them would only grow. By the dawn of the 18th century, Scotland stood at a crossroads. It had fought for independence. It had crowned kings. It had buried heroes. But now it faced a different kind of enemy. Silence, poverty, isolation. For centuries, Scotland had looked outward, fighting wars, building alliances. But one bold venture would shake the entire kingdom to its core: the Darien Scheme. In 1698, Scotland tried to build a colony, New Caledonia, on the coast of Panama. It was a daring move, a national dream, a way to join the empire-building powers of the world. But what began as hope ended in horror, disease, starvation, conflict with the Spanish. Nearly every colonist perished. The ships returned empty, or didn't return at all. The nation's pride was shattered. And worse, its banks were drained. Scotland, quite simply, was broke. Meanwhile, just across the border, England watched. And it saw an opportunity. England needed security, especially after King William III survived assassination attempts and France remained a threat. And Scotland needed stability, trade, and cash. So, a deal was offered. Unite the kingdoms. Form one parliament, one flag, one empire. But to many Scots, it wasn't a union. It was a surrender. In 1707, after secret meetings, political pressure, and many believed English bribes, the Scottish Parliament voted to dissolve itself. We're bought and sold for English gold. That's what Robert Burns would later write, and he wasn't wrong. Records show gold flowing into the pockets of those who signed the treaty. The Union of 1707 was sealed. Scotland and England became the Kingdom of Great Britain. Some celebrated. Merchants gained access to English markets. Some nobles gained titles, lands, and comfort. But the people? They wept. In Edinburgh, crowds gathered outside Parliament, mourning what they called the death of a nation. Some burned effigies, others fell silent. Gaelic-speaking Highlanders barely knew what the treaty meant, but they would soon feel its weight, because from this point forward, the story of Scotland would no longer be written in isolation, but in tension, in alliance and resistance. Was it union? Was it conquest? That debate still rages today, but what's certain is this: a crown was shared, a voice was lost, and a question was born that has never truly died. By the mid-18th century, Scotland was officially part of the United Kingdom. But beneath the surface, old loyalties burned hot, and one name continued to stir hearts, from the glens of the Highlands to the cathedrals of France: Stuart. The House of Stewart had ruled Scotland since 1371. They were Scottish by blood, royal by birth, and Catholic by faith. And in 1603, after centuries of war, the Stuarts had united the crowns. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. But that unity was uneasy. A century later, the balance of power shifted once again. In 1688, King James VII of Scotland, also known as James II of England, was removed from the throne. He was a devout Catholic, ruling over a largely Protestant kingdom. Fearing a return to Catholic rule, powerful nobles invited his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, to take the crown. James fled into exile. This bloodless takeover became known as the Glorious Revolution, a moment that would end the direct reign of the Stuarts, but not the fight to bring them back. But many in Scotland, Ireland, and northern England refused to accept it. They believed in divine right, that kings were chosen by God, not by Parliament. To them, James was still the rightful king, And so they became known as Jacobites, from Jacobus, the Latin name for James. For over 50 years, they would rise again and again, 1715, 1719, and finally, in 1745, the greatest uprising of them all. That year, a young prince landed on Scottish soil. Charles Edward Stuart, the grandson of the exiled king. He was only 24, handsome, bold, fluent in French, and to many he was destiny walking. He became known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He didn't arrive with armies, he arrived with hope, and in the Highlands that was enough. Clans that had resisted British rule for generations rose again. MacDonald, MacGregor, Cameron, Fraser. They rallied under the white rose of the Stuarts. The prince captured Edinburgh without firing a shot. At Prestonpans, he crushed a professional British army in less than 15 minutes. Then he marched south into England. By December, the Jacobites were at Derby, just 125 miles from London. The British crown panicked. But the support never came. No English uprising, no French fleet. The dream began to unravel. The Jacobites turned back, and the British army closed in. April 16th, 1746. Culloden Moor, the final stand. The Jacobite army was exhausted, hungry, disorganized. The British were fresh, disciplined, and ruthless. The Highlanders charged through mud and gunfire. They never reached the British line. In less than an hour, it was over. Thousands died, and those who survived were hunted like animals. But the killing didn't stop there. The British commander, the Duke of Cumberland, ordered a scorched earth campaign. Villages were burned, men were executed, women were imprisoned, the very fabric of Highland life was torn apart. Wearing tartan was banned. Speaking Gaelic was criminalized. Clan chiefs were stripped of power. This was not just the defeat of an army. It was the attempted erasure of a culture. The Jacobite cause had ended. The dream of a Stuart restoration was dead, but not the memory. Because in every song of lost love, in every tale told by firelight, Culloden still echoes. Bonnie Prince Charlie still rides, and the last Highland charge still thunders through the soul of Scotland. The smoke of Culloden had barely cleared, and yet Scotland was already facing a new tragedy. This time, there were no swords, no battlefields, no armies. This time, the enemy was profit, and the war was against the people. In the late 1700s, a quiet transformation began. Scotland was no longer seen as a land of clans and warriors, but a land of resources: wool, coal, iron, timber, and where once lived Highland families, herding cattle and growing oats, now stood sheep, thousands of them. To the new landowners, many of them English, many of them Highland chiefs, turned landlords, sheep were more valuable than tenants. And so, one by one, the evictions began. Entire communities were cleared. Men, women, and children, forced from their ancestral homes, sometimes with only minutes to gather their things. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who cried were ignored. The homes were burned. The past erased. The Highland Clearances had begun. To the landlords, it was progress. To the people, it was devastation. Some families moved south, to Glasgow, to Edinburgh. Others crossed oceans to Canada, America, Australia. Many never returned. They carried with them songs, tears, memories of a homeland that no longer had room for them. And while the Highlands emptied, the lowlands roared to life. Scotland was entering the industrial age. Coal mines tore into the earth. Ironworks lit the night sky with fire. Shipyards lined the River Clyde, launching vessels that would power the British Empire. Glasgow, once a modest town, became known as the second city of the empire. There was pride in that: steel, speed, innovation. But there was also pain. Children worked 12-hour shifts in factories. Men lost limbs in machines or died deep in mines. Families crammed into crumbling tenement blocks, 6 to a room. The air was black. The rivers ran grey. and the dreams of many disappeared beneath the grind of gears. Scotland, once a land of locks and legends, had become a nation of smoke and soot. But even in this age of iron and industry, the soul of the country remained. In the pubs, the songs of the Highlands were still sung. In the kitchens, Gaelic was still whispered. And in the shadows, a question still stirred. What have we gained? And what have we lost to get it? Scotland entered the 20th century as part of an empire it had helped to build, with its coal, its ships, its steel, and its people. From the banks of the Clyde to the battlefields of Europe, Scotland played its part. 2 world wars would scar the nation, deeply and permanently. Tens of thousands of Scots never came home, and those who did returned to find the same old struggles, poverty, neglect, and promises that never arrived. The empire was shrinking, but the Scottish voice, it was growing louder. By the 1970s, the cry for change could no longer be ignored. Oil had been discovered in the North Sea, off Scotland's coast. Billions in revenue poured into Britain's economy. And yet many Scots asked, if this oil is ours, why aren't the people benefiting? In 1979, Scotland held its first referendum on devolution, the chance to reclaim a parliament to govern itself. The vote passed, but not by enough. The movement stalled, but the flame didn't die. A new generation rose, more connected to the world, more proud of their identity, and more determined than ever to shape their own future. By the 1990s, the momentum was back, and this time it worked. In 1999, after nearly 300 years, the Scottish Parliament was reopened. A moment of history, of healing, of hope. It was more than politics. It was a restoration of dignity, a nation reclaiming its voice. But even that wasn't the end, because in 2014, the people of Scotland were asked the question so many generations had only dreamed of. Should Scotland be an independent country? It was peaceful. It was passionate. It was powerful. Millions voted. Millions hoped. But in the end, it was 55%, number 45%. Yes, a defeat? Perhaps, but also a beginning. Because since that vote, Scotland's voice has only grown louder. From Brexit to climate action, from education to healthcare, Scots continue to ask, what kind of nation do we want to be? Modern Scotland is not just bagpipes and castles. It's not just memory and myth. It's innovation. It's resilience. It's artists, engineers, thinkers, teachers. It is a land that remembers the past, but refuses to be defined by it. And as the world watches, Scotland stands once again at a crossroads, not in chains, not in silence, but in purpose. The next chapter is still unwritten. But one thing is certain. This is Scotland, and the story isn't over yet.